Sarah stood by the broken window of their small cabin, watching the dust clouds gather on the horizon. Her husband Tom had been drinking again, and she could hear him arguing with someone outside. The autumn of 1882 had been harsh in Montana. Territory in their small farm was failing just like many others in the valley. Tom had always been a hard man, but the drought and failed crops had made him bitter and cruel, spent what little money they had on whiskey instead of food or supplies for the winter. Sarah tried to make ends meet by taking in washing from the nearby town, but it was never enough. Her hands were raw and cracked from the lye soap. Her back ached from bending over the washboard day after day. The sound of horses approaching made her heart race. Through the dusty glass, she saw 3 men on horseback talking to her husband. One of them was holding something that gleamed in the sunlight. Sarah pressed closer to the window and realized it was a rifle. A beautiful Winchester that Tom had been wanting for months. He claimed he needed it for hunting, but Sarah knew he mostly wanted it to show off to the other men in town. She couldn't hear the exact words, but she could see Tom gesturing wildly, pointing toward the cabin, toward her. The pit in her stomach grew larger as she watched the conversation continue. Tom's face was red with excitement, and he kept nodding eagerly. At whatever the strangers were saying, Sarah had seen that look before. Usually when Tom was making deals that would bring trouble to their door, one of the strangers dismounted and walked closer to the cabin. He was a tall, thin man with a scraggly beard and cold eyes that reminded Sarah of a snake. She quickly stepped away from the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Something terrible was happening, and she had no idea what Tom was planning. The front door burst open with a bang that shook the entire cabin. Tom stumbled inside, reeking of whiskey and sweat, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and something else that frightened Sarah more than his usual anger. Behind him came the tall stranger and another man, shorter but equally menacing. With a scar running down his left cheek, Tom grabbed Sarah roughly by the arm, his fingers digging into her, flesh hard enough to leave bruises. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. The smell of alcohol on his breath made her stomach turn as he leaned close to her face. His words came out in a slurred rush, but what he said made her blood run cold. He had made a deal with these men. They wanted a woman to work in their camp, to cook and clean for their crew of railroad workers. In exchange, they would give Tom the Winchester rifle he had been craving, plus $50 in cash. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as she realized what was happening. Her own husband was selling her like a piece of property, trading her life for a gun and some money. The tall stranger looked her up and down like she was livestock at a market. He nodded approvingly and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. Tara tried to speak, to protest, to beg Tom to reconsider, but no words would come out of her throat. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up no matter how hard she tried. Tom snatched the money pouch and held it up to the light, grinning at the sound of the coins. He had already forgotten about his wife's tears already. Planning what he would do with his new wealth, the strangers moved closer to Sarah, and she knew that in a few minutes, she would be dragged away from the only home she had ever known, forced into a life that would be worse than anything she could imagine. Just as the scarred man reached for Sarah's other arm, the sound of galloping horses filled the air outside. The thundering hoofbeats grew louder and closer, causing everyone in the cabin to freeze. Through the open door, dust swirled as a rider approached at full speed, pulling his horse to a dramatic stop just outside their home. The man who dismounted was unlike anyone Sarah had ever seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather jacket and a hat that had seen many miles of travel. His boots made confident sounds on the wooden porch as he stepped toward the doorway. Most striking of all were his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to take in everything at once, missing no detail of the scene before him. The stranger tipped his hat politely to Sarah, completely ignoring the 3 men who had been in the middle of their terrible transaction. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, with a slight drawl that suggested he had traveled far from the southern states. He introduced himself simply as Jake, saying he had been riding through the area and noticed the gathering of horses. He wondered if there might be trouble that required assistance. Tom tried to put on his best fake smile, the one he used when he wanted to convince someone of a lie. He waved his hand dismissively and told Jake that everything was fine, just some business between friends. But Jake's sharp eyes had already noticed several things that told a different story. He saw the fear in Sarah's face, the way she was being held against her will, and the money changing hands. The tall stranger with the snake-like eyes grew impatient and told Jake to mind his own business and move along. I said they had important matters to conclude and did not need interference from passing travelers. But Jake did not seem intimidated by the man's harsh tone or threatening posture. Instead, he stepped further into the cabin, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Jake looked directly at Sarah and asked if she was being treated fairly, and if she needed any help. His voice was gentle but loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but Tom quickly interrupted, claiming that his wife was perfectly happy and that Jake had no right to question their family affairs. But Jake was not fooled by Tom's nervous chatter. He had spent years traveling through frontier towns and had seen this kind of situation before. He knew the signs of a woman being sold or traded against her will, and he recognized the type of men who would make such deals. His jaw tightened as he realized exactly what was happening in this small cabin. The tension in the room grew thicker as Jake continued to study the scene. He noticed the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall, still with its price tag attached. He saw the leather pouch of coins in Tom's sweaty palm. Most importantly, saw the tears streaming down Sarah's face and the bruises forming on her arm where Tom had grabbed her. Without warning, Jake stepped forward and spoke directly to the two strangers. He told them that he had $100 in cash, plus his own horse and saddle, and he was willing to make a counteroffer for whatever transaction they had been discussing. The room fell completely silent as everyone tried to understand what the cowboy was proposing. The scarred man laughed and said that Jake clearly did not understand the nature of their business. But Jake's expression remained serious as he explained that he understood perfectly well. He had seen enough injustice in his travels, and he was prepared to pay whatever price was necessary to prevent another tragedy from occurring. Tom's eyes grew wide with greed as he calculated the value of Jake's offer. Twice what the strangers had offered, and a good horse was worth at least another $50. But the tall stranger was not pleased with this unexpected competition. He moved his hand closer to his own weapon and warned Jake that interfering with their arrangement could lead to serious consequences. Jake smiled for the first time since entering the cabin, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of an expression that made dangerous men think twice about their actions. He told the stranger that he had faced serious consequences before and was not easily frightened by threats from men who traded in human misery. The atmosphere in the small cabin became electric with danger as the two parties faced each other. Tom stood in the middle, his eyes darting back and forth between the original buyers and Jake, calculating which deal would bring him the most profit. Sarah remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe as she watched this strange negotiation unfold around her. Jake reached into his jacket and slowly pulled out a thick roll of bills, letting everyone see exactly how much money he carried. He counted out $100 in crisp banknotes, laying them carefully on the wooden table that dominated the center of the room. The sight of so much cash made Tom's mouth water with greed, and even the two strangers seemed impressed by the cowboy's wealth, but the tall stranger was not ready to give up his prize so easily. He whispered something urgent to his scarred companion, who nodded and disappeared outside. Within minutes, he returned carrying a second rifle and another pouch of coins. They increased their offer to $75 plus both weapons. Claiming that Tom would be a fool to refuse such generous terms, Jake listened to their counteroffer, without showing any emotion on his weathered face. When they finished speaking, he calmly added another $50 to the pile of money on the table, bringing his total offer to $150 plus his horse and saddle. He explained that he had been saving this money for months, planning to buy his own piece of land somewhere in California, but he was willing to spend every penny to prevent what he saw happening here. Tom could barely contain his excitement as he stared at the pile of money. His hands shook as he reached toward the cash, but the tall stranger grabbed his wrist and warned him not to make any hasty decisions. The stranger's voice was low and menacing as he reminded Tom that they had other ways of getting what they wanted, ways that did not involve payment at all. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the threat behind the stranger's words. These were not men who would simply walk away if they did not get their way. They had probably taken women before, with or without permission from husbands or fathers. The scared look in the stranger's companion's eyes suggested that Jake had stumbled into a situation more dangerous than he realized. But Jake seemed completely unafraid of the veiled threats. He had dealt with bullies and criminals throughout his years of wandering, and he recognized their tactics. Instead of backing down, he increased the pressure by adding his most prized possession to the offer. He unbuckled his gun belt, revealing a beautiful Colt revolver with an ivory handle, and placed it on the table next to the money. The weapon was clearly worth a fortune, crafted by skilled gunsmiths and decorated with intricate engravings. Tom's eyes grew even wider as he imagined himself wearing such a magnificent gun, strutting through town like a real gunfighter. The total value of Jake's offer was now well over $200. It's more money than Tom had seen in his entire life. The two strangers huddled together in urgent conversation, speaking in whispers that no one else could understand. They seemed to be debating whether to accept defeat or resort to violence to get what they came for. Sarah watched their faces carefully, trying to read their intentions, praying that Jake's generous offer would be enough to end this nightmare peacefully. Finally, Jake made one last addition to his proposal that shocked everyone in the room. He offered to throw in his saddlebags, which contained supplies, ammunition, and various tools that would be valuable to any frontier family. But more importantly, he announced that he would also provide Tom with a letter of introduction to a cattle ranch in Wyoming, where the owner was always looking for reliable workers. This final offer represented not just immediate wealth, but also the possibility of steady employment and a fresh start. Tom's alcohol-clouded mind struggled to process the incredible opportunity being presented to him. He had never imagined that selling his wife could lead to such prosperity. He began to see Jake as a godsend rather than an interference. The tall stranger realized that they could not possibly match Jake's offer, and his face grew dark with anger and frustration. He had been looking forward to adding Sarah to his collection of workers. He did not appreciate having his plans disrupted by a wandering cowboy with too much money and too much conscience. Tom's greed finally overcame any remaining loyalty to the original buyers. Without hesitation, he snatched up the money from the table and stuffed it into his pockets. Grinning like a man who had just struck gold, he grabbed Jake's gun belt and strapped it around his waist, admiring how the ivory handle caught. The afternoon light streaming through the window, the tall stranger's face turned red with rage as he realized that Tom had chosen Jake's offer over. He stepped forward menacingly, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Jake was faster. The cowboy's hand shot out and gripped the stranger's wrist with surprising strength, preventing him from drawing his gun. Jake's voice remained calm, but there was steel in his words as he suggested that the two men accept their defeat gracefully and leave peacefully. The scarred companion tried to circle round behind Jake, but the cowboy seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. Without releasing his grip on the first man, Jake spun around and delivered a swift kick that sent the second attacker stumbling backward into the wall. The cabin shook from the impact, and several dishes fell from the shelves, shattering on the floor. Realizing that they were outmatched, the two strangers reluctantly backed toward the door. But the tall one could not resist making one final threat. He pointed at Jake and promised that they would remember his face and that their paths would cross again someday when the cowboy was not expecting trouble. Jake simply tipped his hat and suggested that they might want to find a different line of work, one that did not involve trading in human beings. After the strangers rode away in a cloud of dust and anger, an uncomfortable silence settled over the cabin. Tom was busy admiring his new wealth and weapons, but Sarah remained frozen in place, unsure of what would happen to her next. She looked at Jake with a mixture of gratitude and fear, wondering what kind of man would spend his life. Savings to buy a woman he had never met before. Jake seemed to understand her confusion and fear, walked slowly toward her, his movements careful and non-threatening, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and reassuring. completely different from the commanding tone he had used with the strangers and her husband. He told Sarah that she had nothing to fear from him, that he had no intention of taking her anywhere against her will. He explained that he had spent his own money not to own her, but to free her from the terrible situation he had witnessed. His only goal was to make sure she had the power to choose her own future, something that had been taken away from her by cruel men who saw women as property to be bought and sold. Sarah found her voice for the first time since the ordeal began. With tears streaming down her face, she asked Jake why he had done such a thing, why he had given up his dreams of owning land in California to help a complete stranger. His answer was simple and profound. He told her that he had grown up watching his own mother suffer under the control of a violent father, and he had sworn never to stand by while another woman endured similar treatment. Jake reached into his remaining belongings and pulled out a small leather pouch containing $20 more. He pressed it into Sarah's hands, explaining that this was her freedom money, enough to buy passage on a stagecoach to anywhere she wanted to go. He had contacts in several towns who could help her find honest work as a seamstress, teacher, or housekeeper, jobs that would allow her to support herself with dignity. Tom, who had been counting his money and admiring his new possessions, suddenly realized what Jake was suggesting. His face twisted with anger as he protested that Sarah was still his wife and had no right to leave him. He claimed ownership over her, just as he might claim ownership over a horse or a cow, demanding that Jake respect the legal bonds of marriage. But Jake's expression hardened as he turned to face Tom directly. He reminded the drunken man that he had just sold his wife to strangers for money and weapons, effectively ending any claim he might have had to her loyalty or obedience. By putting a price on his wife's freedom, Tom had revealed exactly how much his marriage vows meant to him. The cowboy's words cut through Tom's protests like a knife through butter. Even in his alcohol-impaired state, Tom could not argue with the logic of Jake's statement. He had indeed treated his wife like property, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. Sarah looked back and forth between the two men, hardly daring to believe that she might actually have a choice in determining her own fate. Sarah stood in the middle of the cabin, clutching the small pouch of money Jake had given her, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden possibility of freedom. For years, she had dreamed of escaping her miserable life with Tom, but she had never imagined it could actually happen. Now, with $20 in her hand and a kind stranger offering to help her start over, the dream seemed within reach. Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes and understood that making such a big decision was not easy after years of having no choices at all. He sat down at the table and spoke to her in a patient, encouraging voice. He told her about the towns he had visited where women lived independently, running their own businesses and making their own decisions about their lives. He described a place called Silver Creek, about 3 days' journey by stagecoach, where a widow named Mrs. Peterson ran a boarding house and was always looking for reliable help. The work would be honest and the pay fair, and Sarah would have her own room, and the respect that every person deserved. Jake had stayed there during his travels and knew Mrs. Peterson to be a kind woman who had helped other women escape difficult situations. As Jake painted this picture of possibility, Sarah felt something stirring in her heart that she had not felt in years. Hope. She began to imagine herself in a clean dress, serving meals to grateful travelers, earning her own money, and sleeping peacefully without fear. The vision was so beautiful that it brought fresh tears to her eyes, but these were tears of joy rather than despair. Tom, meanwhile, was growing more agitated as he realized that his wife might actually leave him. Despite his cruel treatment of her, he had grown accustomed to having someone to cook his meals, wash his clothes, and tend to the household chores. The thought of living alone in the failing cabin, with no one to blame for his problems, filled him with panic. He tried a different approach, attempting to manipulate Sarah with false promises and crocodile tears. He claimed that he was sorry for his behavior, that the alcohol had made him do terrible things, and that he would change if she would only give him another chance. He promised to stop drinking, to treat her better, and to be the husband she deserved. But Sarah had heard these empty promises too many times before. Every time Tom got into serious trouble, he would make grand speeches about changing his ways, but within days, he would return to his old patterns of drinking and abuse. She no longer believed a word he said, and his desperate pleading only strengthened her resolve to leave. Jake watched this exchange with growing anger. He had seen men like Tom before, bullies who alternated between violence and fake remorse to control the women in their lives. He knew that Tom's promises were worthless, and that Sarah would never be safe as long as she remained under his control. When Tom's begging failed to convince Sarah, his true nature emerged once again, his face twisted with rage as he accused her of being an ungrateful wife who did not appreciate all the sacrifices he had made for their marriage. He claimed that he had worked hard to provide for her, conveniently forgetting that most of their problems came from his drinking and gambling rather than any external circumstances. Jake stood up from the table, his patience finally exhausted. He told Tom, in no uncertain terms, that he had forfeited any right to Sarah's gratitude when he decided to sell her to strangers. A real husband would protect his wife, not trade her away for money and weapons. Tom's actions had revealed him to be nothing more than a selfish coward, who put his own desires above his wife's safety and dignity. Sarah felt a surge of strength flow through her as she listened to Jake defend her worth as a human being. For the first time in her adult life, someone was treating her with respect and recognizing her right to make her own choices. She looked at Tom, seeing him clearly for what he truly was, and felt the last chains of fear and obligation fall away. From her heart, with a voice that grew stronger with each word, Sarah told Tom that their marriage was over. She had endured years of cruelty and neglect, hoping that he would change. But his willingness to sell her had shown her that he would never see her as anything more than property. She was choosing to accept Jake's offer of help and start anew. Life somewhere far away from this place of misery. Tom's face went through a series of emotions as he realized that his wife was serious about leaving. First came disbelief, then anger, then a kind of desperate calculation as he tried to think of ways to stop her. But Jake's presence made any violent action impossible, and Tom knew that he had no legal or moral authority to prevent Sarah from leaving after what he had tried to do. Within an hour, Sarah had packed her few belongings into a small carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. She owned very little after years of poverty, but each item she chose to take held special meaning: a silver locket with her parents, pictures, a worn Bible that had provided comfort during her darkest hours, and a quilt she had sewn during the early days of her marriage when she still believed in happiness. Jake helped her secure her possessions and offered his own coat to keep her warm during the journey. He explained that the stagecoach would arrive in the nearby town of Millerville the following morning, and he would escort her there to make sure she got safely on her way to Silver Creek. He had already written a letter of introduction to Mrs. D. Peterson, explaining Sarah's situation and vouching for her character and work ethic. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Tom made one final desperate attempt to change Sarah's mind. He threw himself at her feet, weeping dramatically and begging her not to abandon him. He claimed that he would not survive without her, that she was the only good thing in his worthless life, and that losing her would destroy him completely. Sarah looked down at her husband with a mixture of pity and disgust. She had once loved this man, or at least she had loved the person she thought he could become. But years of disappointment and abuse had killed whatever feelings she had once possessed. His tears meant nothing to her now, because she knew they were motivated by self-pity. Rather than genuine remorse or love, she told Tom that he had made his choice when he decided to sell her, and now she was making hers. If he truly wanted to change his life, he had plenty of money and resources to do so. He could stop drinking, find honest work, and try to become a better person. But she would not be there to watch him fail again. She would not sacrifice her own chance at happiness for his empty promises. Jake and Sarah left the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. They rode together toward Millerville, Jake on foot leading his horse while Sarah rode, both of them quiet as they contemplated the strange events of the day. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of change. During their journey, Jake told Sarah more about his own life and travels. He had been wandering for over 10 years, working as a ranch hand trail, guide, and sometimes lawmen in various frontier towns. He had seen the best and worst of human nature, but he had never lost his faith in the possibility that good people could make a difference in the world by standing up for what was right. Sarah listened to his stories with growing admiration for this unusual man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayer. She asked him what he planned to do now that he had spent his savings and given up his dream of buying land in California. Jake smiled and said that dreams were flexible things, and helping her had been worth more than any piece of property. They spent the night at a respectable boarding house in Millerville, with Jake paying for separate rooms and ensuring that Sarah felt completely safe and comfortable. The next morning, he helped her board the stagecoach to Silver Creek, making sure the driver understood that she was a lady traveling alone who deserved protection and courtesy during the journey. As the stagecoach prepared to depart, Sarah realized that she might never see Jake again. This man had changed her life forever, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing that he had done the right thing. She pressed a small folded paper into his hand, containing the address where she would be staying in Silver Creek, and told him that he would always be welcome there if his travels ever brought him in that direction. Jake tipped his hat one final time as the stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust. He watched until it disappeared around a bend in the road, and mounted his remaining horse and headed west toward the mountains. He had given up his original dream of owning land in California, but he had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that Sarah would have a chance to build a life of her own choosing. 6 months later, him through several post offices as he continued his wanderings, Sarah wrote that she had arrived safely in Silver Creek and found work with Mrs. Peterson, who had welcomed her with open arms. She was earning her own money, had made friends with other women in town, and for the first time in years she went to sleep each night without fear. She thanked Jake for giving her not just freedom, but the courage to believe that she deserved a better life. She signed the letter, "Your forever grateful friend, Sarah," and enclosed a small photograph of herself, smiling genuinely for the first time in years.